caravels of the age of discovery, wings of the ocean. Imagine a vessel so light, so agile it seemed to dance upon the waves rather than cut through them. A ship with sails that could catch the faintest breath of wind, and a hull so shallow it could glide into rivers no deeper than a man is tall. This was the Caravel, a modest craft by the standards of empires, yet the very engine of global transformation. More than cannons, crowns, or conquests, it was the Caravel that carried Europe beyond the edge of its maps. On her decks stood the dreamers, the navigators, the desperate, and the devout. Prince Henry's captains, Vasco da Gama, Bartolomeu Dias, and most famously, Christopher Columbus. Though she never ruled the seas like the galleons that followed, the Caravel opened them. She was not built for war, but for wonder, not for cargo, but for curiosity. In an age when the ocean was feared as a void, the Caravel taught men to see it as a path. Her triangular sails, borrowed from Arab dhows, allowed her to sail into the wind, a miracle of physics that shattered ancient limits. With her, the Portuguese crept down the coast of Africa, inch by terrifying inch, until they rounded the Cape and touched the shores of India. With her, Spaniards crossed the Atlantic and stumbled upon continents they never knew existed. This is the story not of one ship, but of a type, a design so perfectly suited to its time that it changed the course of human history. We will follow the Caravel from her humble origins in Iberian fishing villages, through the golden age of exploration, to her quiet retirement as larger ships took her place. And though no original Caravel survives intact, her spirit sails on, in every map, every border, every story of discovery. So settle in, dear listener. Let the rhythm of the tide and the whisper of canvas carry you back to the 15th century, when the world was still being found, one Caravel at a time. The Caravel did not emerge in a vacuum. She was born of necessity, ambition, and geography, in a time when Europe stood poised between medieval isolation and global connection. It was the early 1400s. The Black Death had receded, leaving societies hungry for renewal. Trade routes to the east, once open through the Silk Road, were now choked by the rising Ottoman Empire. Spices, silks, and precious stones grew scarce and expensive. Venice and Genoa grew rich as middlemen, but the kingdoms of the Atlantic, Portugal and Castile, had no access to these riches. They looked not east, but west and south. Portugal, a small nation clinging to the western edge of Europe, had the longest Atlantic coastline and the strongest maritime tradition. Under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, a man who never sailed himself, but whose mind charted new worlds, Portugal began a systematic exploration of the African coast. His goal? To find a sea route to the gold and spice lands of the Indies, bypassing Muslim-controlled territories. But the ships of the time were ill-suited for such voyages. Cogs and hulks, broad, slow, and square-rigged, could carry cargo, but they could not sail against the wind. They hugged the coast, terrified of losing sight of land. What was needed was a vessel that could venture into the open ocean, tack against contrary winds, and survive the treacherous currents off West Africa. Into this need stepped the Caravel, a ship already known to coastal fishermen, now refined into an instrument of empire. The Caravel's origins lie not in royal shipyards, but in the humble ports of Galicia and the Algarve, regions where Portuguese and Spanish fishermen had long used small, nimble boats to work the Atlantic's rough waters. These early caravelas were lateen-rigged with one or two masts and triangular sails that allowed them to maneuver close to shore and into river mouths. In the 1430s and 1440s, under Prince Henry's direction, shipwrights at Sagres, Leão, and Arturo, Lagos, began modifying this design. They lengthened the hull, added a third mast, and introduced a hybrid rig, 2 lateen sails for agility and a square sail on the foremast for speed when running before the trade winds. This Caravella Redonda. Round-rigged caravel became the standard for oceanic exploration. Construction was artisanal and local. Master carpenters, often illiterate but deeply skilled, worked without blueprints, guided by tradition and trial. The keel was laid first, usually from sturdy oak or chestnut. Frames were bent using steam and rope, then planked with yutye, apine, adati, or fir, lighter woods that kept the ship fast and buoyant. Caulking was done with adya okum, hemp fiber, and yakaki pine tar, sealing the seams against the sea. Unlike warships or merchantmen, caravels were built for speed and versatility, not capacity. They carried no heavy cargo, only provisions, trade goods, and a small crew. Their shallow draft, often less than 2 meters, allowed them to enter uncharted estuaries and anchor close to shore, a critical advantage when landing on unknown coasts. No single inventor is credited with the caravel's design. Rather, she was a product of cultural fusion, Iberian hull forms, Arab sail technology, and Norse clinker building influences blended into something entirely new. She was, in essence, the first truly global ship. What made the caravel so revolutionary? Let us step aboard and see. A typical ocean-going caravel of the late 15th century measured about 20 to 30 meters, 65 to 100 feet, in length with a beam of 6 to 8 meters, 20 to 26 feet. Her displacement was modest, 50 to 150 tons, making her tiny compared to later galleons, but perfect for exploration. She carried 2 or 3 masts. The main and mizzen masts bore lateen sails, large triangular sails suspended from long yards that could be swung to catch wind from almost any direction. The foremast often carried a square sail, added later to increase speed on long oceanic runs. This hybrid rig gave the caravel unmatched maneuverability. She could sail within 45 degrees of the wind, a feat impossible for square-rigged ships. Her hull was narrow and sleek, with a pronounced keel for stability and a single deck. There was no towering forecastle or stern castle, just a modest raised platform at bow and stern for lookouts and steering. The rudder was mounted on the stern post, controlled by a tiller or, on larger models, a whipstaff, a precursor to the ship's wheel. Armament was light, perhaps 4 to 8 small cannons, swivel guns called versos, and a few bombards for signaling or defense against pirates. Her true weapon was not firepower, but stealth and speed. The crew numbered 20 to 40 men. Sailors, a pilot, a scribe, sometimes a priest. Provisions included hardtack, salted fish, wine and water in casks. Navigation relied on the magnetic compass, the astrolabe for measuring the sun's altitude, and dead reckoning, plotting position based on estimated speed and direction. Her top speed? 6 to 9 knots. Respectable for the era, but her real genius lay in her ability to tack, jibe, and hug the wind, allowing her to explore coastlines, escape storms, and return home when others would be lost. The caravel's first great triumph came in 1434, when Gil Eanes, sailing under Prince Henry's orders, finally rounded Cape Bojador, a point on the West African coast long believed to be the edge of the navigable world. For decades, ships had turned back here, fearing sea monsters, boiling waters, or the end of the earth. Eanes, in a small caravel, pushed through and found only more ocean. From there, Portuguese caravels crept southward, year by year. 1441. Nuno Tristão reached the Arguin Bay, capturing the first African slaves, marking the tragic beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. 1470s. caravels mapped the carved Gulf of Guinea, discovering islands like São Tomé and Príncipe. 1482, Diogo Cao erected stone pillars, or padrões, along the Congo River, claiming lands for Portugal. Then, in 1488, Bartolomeu Dias achieved the impossible. Commanding 2 caravels and a supply ship, he was blown south by a storm and emerged on the eastern side of Africa. He had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving a sea route to India existed. His caravels, battered but triumphant, returned to Lisbon with news that would reshape global trade. A decade later, Vasco da Gama used larger, reinforced caravels to sail all the way to Calicut, India, 1498, opening the direct spice route and making Portugal the richest maritime power in Europe. Meanwhile, in Spain, Christopher Columbus chose 2 caravels, La Niña and La Pinta, for his 1492 voyage across the Atlantic. Though his flagship, Santa Maria, was a heavier, now it was the caravels that proved indispensable. Faster, more maneuverable, and crucial in exploring Caribbean islands after the Santa Maria wrecked. Caravels also carried Pedro Álvares Cabral Tash to Brazil, 1500. Amerigo Vespucci, along the South American coast, and Viricati Ferdinand Magellan's. Scouts during the first circumnavigation, 1519 to 1522. Wherever the unknown began, a caravel was likely the first to enter it. Not all caravel voyages ended in glory. Many vanished without a trace, swallowed by storms, dashed on reefs, or lost to mutiny and disease. The ocean was unforgiving. One of the most haunting tales is that of Gaspar Correal, 1501, a Portuguese explorer who sailed to Newfoundland in search of the Northwest Passage. His caravel returned with indigenous captives, but Correal and his brother's ship were never seen again. Another tragedy struck Álvaro Fernandes in 1445, when his caravel was ambushed by West African warriors after a trading dispute. Only a few survivors made it back to Portugal, their ship riddled with arrows. Yet the caravel also inspired legends of resilience. La Niña, Columbus's smallest ship, survived the 1492 voyage, a hurricane in 1495, and continued sailing for decades, earning a reputation as the luckiest ship in the Spanish fleet. Perhaps the most poetic moment came in Euro 1499, when Vasco da Gama's caravels returning from India were so worn that their crews had to sew patches of sailcloth with their own hair to keep the winds in their sails. They limped into Lisbon like ghosts, sunburned, bearded, half-starved, but bearing spices worth more than their weight in gold. These stories of courage, error, and endurance cemented the caravel's place not just in history, but in myth. Though caravels faded from use by the mid-16th century, replaced by larger cannon-heavy galleons, they never vanished from memory. In Portugal, they became national symbols, the Padrão dos Descobrimentos. Monument to the Discoveries, in Lisbon features a caravel at its prow, carrying Prince Henry and his captains into eternity. Coins, stamps, and school books all bear her image. In literature, she sails through Camões, the Lusíads. 1572, the Portuguese national epic, where caravels are birds of the sea guided by divine will. In modern fiction, she appears in Shakespeare's The Tempest as the shipwrecked vessel in Carrick, Patrick O'Brien's novels, and in films like 1492, Conquest of Paradise. 1992, where Ridley Scott lovingly recreated La Niña and La Pinta. Museums honor her too. Full-scale replicas stand in Lisbon, Palos de la Frontera, Spain, Madeira, and Columbus, Ohio. Visitors can walk her decks, feel the lateen yards overhead, and imagine the terror and wonder of sailing into the unknown. Even in science, her name endures. NASA's Caravel program for oceanographic research, and the Caravel jet airliner of the 1950s, both named for her grace and pioneering spirit. And in the language of exploration, Caravel remains a metaphor for any vessel of discovery, whether physical, intellectual, or spiritual. The Caravel was never the largest, strongest, or most ornate ship ever built. She carried no thrones, no treasures, no armies. Yet she did something no warship ever could. She made the world smaller. By enabling sustained oceanic travel, the Caravel initiated the Columbian Exchange, the global spice trade, and the tragic but irreversible complex interconnection of continents. She carried not just men, but ideas, diseases, crops, and cultures, forever altering the human story. Her genius lay in simplicity. She asked little of the sea and gave much in return. She was light enough to be daring, strong enough to endure, and clever enough to harness the wind in ways no European ship had before. Today, as container ships cross oceans in days and satellites map every reef, it is humbling to remember a time when crossing a few hundred miles of open water was an act of faith. The Caravel was the bridge between fear and knowledge, between myth and map. Though no original survives, her legacy floats in every harbor, in every child who dreams of distant shores, in every wind that fills a sail. For the Caravel did not just discover new lands, she taught humanity how to dream beyond the horizon. And so, as the stars wheel overhead and the tide turns once more, we remember her, not with fanfare, but with gratitude. For she was the quiet wing that carried the world into its modern age.